Okay, so if you've already played with some of them, we can continue on seeing different applications or how we can use this with effectors to control what to do what we like. Okay. So, of course, like with end side, you can even make it a line. Very simple triangles, of course, but let's keep it a line, as if we are making a pattern. So, from the front view, we can easily see it as a flat drawing, maybe. So notice how you can immediately create very simple. So let's say 45 degrees. Let's rotate this 45 degrees. And instead of honeycomb, I'll just make it a grid. Okay. So you can always rotate them in 3D space and do some interesting stuff, but it becomes much more interesting when we combine these with three-dimensional forms. So that is another mode of cloner, not the linear, radial, grid or honeycomb, but the object. So when you choose the object mode of the cloner, you notice that it seems to be nothing is happening because it needs an object here to tell this cloner generator on which object we want it to clone this child of it. So for that, I'll just delete all of these, or let's say these. So I'll create a sphere, okay, and I want this cloner to clone this end sides on top of this sphere, okay. So the cloner has this mode selected, object mode, okay, and I'll just drag and drop this sphere by dragging and dropping to this object here. Notice that how when I hover around this box, how it grabs the name of the object, okay? I leave the mouse button, and when I do that, you can see the lines started to stick on the surface of this sphere, okay? The lines are too long maybe because it's 200 centimeters. I'll just decrease the size of it. 95 centimeters I made it. So in the cloner object again, the attributes panel, this object is determined as the sphere, which is this, okay? Now, underneath this space, there are some additional properties after I added this sphere object here. The first is align clone. When I select and deselect, activate and deactivate that, notice how the clones are aligned in some sense onto the surface of that. Okay. And first familiar thing that catches my attention is the count. So if I increase the count, you can see that it seems like we are making this surface a little bit hairy, right? So there are now 976 lines cloned on the surface of that. Now how this is distributed around this sphere is random, because its distribution is selected as the surface, and you can see that we can understand that it's randomly placed because there's a seed value here. So if I change the seed, Notice how slightly it changes, or I'll decrease the number to this, okay? And if I change the seed, you can see that the placement of these things are changing. Maybe this end side is not so suitable. I'll delete that. I'll make this a spiky object, and I'll add cones. I need to decrease the scale of the cone first by selecting the cone and using the scale tool to scale it down, and put this cone underneath this cloner, and notice that how they're cloned on top of that surface. But what I don't like is that they are not pointing outwards. They are placed like half of it is submerged into the surface of the sphere, right? Any suggestions how I can make this point outwards? There's no single way, but one is more efficient or optimized than the others. So, but anything goes, just throw something up. I want the cones to point outwards from the surface of the sphere. Where should I look? Where the cloner objects distribution. Okay, here. So let's see. I have other distribution options here. So I'll just try another one. Okay, not this. And not about this actually. I'll show this, but thank you for guessing. Another option, guess? Another idea? Do you understood what I want, right?
Maybe change the orientation.
Orientation of what? Okay, where can I change that? Okay. Here. Okay, let's try. Okay, something is happening. Yeah. So this is the most correct way. As I said, like if you want to change the orientation or adjust the placement of an object, parametric object, just go and either change the orientation or the plane of that object. So if it's a rectangle or a spline, it is called a plane. So plane option changes the orientation. If it's a 3D object like a cone, it's the orientation, right? So I made it point outwards, or I can make it point inwards actually. So for this I want to point outwards. Okay. Now I can see better that the distribution is randomly made. So if I change the seed, I can see that it's being randomly placed on the surface, right? So now let's look at the distribution. So I'll just open the lines mode, ground shading lines mode from the display menu here again to see how the surface is subdivided. So the distribution option here allows you to determine where these child objects will be put on the surface. Now it says surface. So surface is the whole surface of this. So there's no specific point. But if I change it to vertex, notice what happens. So when I change the distribution to vertex, it says that take this cone and place that cone at each vertex of this object, of this sphere object, right? So now, notice that there is no count option here. Why?
Because the vertex number is stable.
Yeah. So what if I want to change the number of generated clones? Well, how can I change the number of cones?
Increase
Okay, right? So I go to the sphere and then play with the segments number, right? So because it's now determined by the subdivision or the segments of the mesh, now it doesn't appear as a count number here, but now I should go to sphere and play with that. Okay, so this is very important for cloner. That vertex option and also other options like edge option. Notice that now how they are generated at the middle point of those edges. Okay, and there's also the polygon center option, which makes something like this. And surface is what we saw. And there's also another option called volume. Okay, volume, actually, I'll just hide this sphere. By the way, there's a difference between these two buttons. I haven't shown you these two small dots. This green, red dot that is next to each object. So the difference between these and this check mark here is like this check mark disables or enables the object, while this dot here hides or shows the object. This means that this is functioning, this object is functioning since it's checked, but it's hidden from the view. Okay? When you double click these dots, it hides from the viewport, and the bottom one hides from the render. So now I hid the sphere, but it's still functioning, so that I can see what's inside that. So I'll go to the cloner again and change the number there. So as I increase the number of that, I can see that it's filling inside the sphere, right? So yeah, there's a random and surface mode of the volume again. So I'll just go to the surface mode again, and you can see that, okay, cones are there, but there's no sphere visible. Okay, because it's hidden from here, this red dot that is visible here. Okay. So, as I said, this distribution mode of the cloner, which is like, let's say again, polygon center this time, and I'll show the sphere again. Notice that how some part of these cones are submerged inside the surface of that, right? So for the sphere, I can change the type of this mesh from here. So basically, by default, it's called the standard. But if I change this type, hemisphere, tetrahedron, hexahedron, octahedron, or icosahedron, notice that how the placement of these spikes are immediately changed. Notice that, or remember that the sphere, the most even distribution of these polygons is in the icosahedron mode. So if you want to evenly distribute an object over a sphere, you should be choosing this icosahedron mode type, right? So because if I choose the standard, notice that how they are denser at the top poles and less dense at the equator, maybe, let's say. So I choose the icosahedron, and now if I decrease or increase the segments, you can see how the surface responds to that. Okay. So in the cloner, again, I can place them at the polygon center or vertex. Notice how it again affects how the cones or clones are packed with each other. So this is the placement on distribution on vertex, this is edge, this is polygon center. This might not be so visible in this one, but it affects a lot when you're dealing with other type of geometries. So, okay, any questions until now, or any problems cloning on top of a geometry? Or do you want me to slow down? No? Yes?
Hocam,
Yes.
sadece şey kısmını tekrardan anlatabilir misiniz? Bu konuları resmin üstüne nasıl koyduğunuz kısmı.
Okay.
Bahset.
Cone, yeah. This cone, the cloner has a mode called object mode, right? When you select that object mode, it needs an object here, which means like, okay, I'm going to clone this cone, but you have to tell me on which object I must clone these objects, okay? And this is the part where I tell this cloner which that object is. So I drag the sphere and put that inside here so that it's connected with this cloner. So cloner knows that it will take this cone and put it on top of this sphere, okay? So when I put this sphere there, then these options appear, okay? So you'll be needing this very much in your assignment, the first assignment that I'll give you. So these parts are important. Also, when you're cloning on top of a geometry, you have the option to scale these clones according to the for example, the size of these surfaces or the polygons that you're cloning onto. So notice what happens when I check this enable scaling thing. Okay, for now it's not so evident. So polygon center, let's check vertex. Okay, it's not so evident. Edge, not so evident because it's because this icosahedron is more or less evenly distributed polygons. But when this enable scaling is selected, active, and when the sphere type is not icosahedron but standard, notice how the clones are scaled down towards the top and scaled up towards the middle of this sphere. See? So when I increase the segmentation, it adjusts the scaling of the clones also. So now, since these parts are smaller, the clones are scaled smaller. Since these parts are larger polygons, the clones are scaled larger. So again, let's go to the cloner and in the distribution type, select vertex or select edge. You see how evenly distributed all these cones are. Scale on edge is not active at this time, okay. So there is no one right way to do things while using these tools. So it's very important for you to experiment with different options, okay? Polygon center, okay. So yeah, instead of a sphere, I can obviously clone on top of a cube, right? So in the cloner, instead of the sphere here, I'll just drag this cube that I created, and I'll drag that into the object here. And now with that, it created a giant cone. Probably it's because the enable scaling is active. I'll just deactivate that. And okay, something is happening. Okay, only the centers of the cube generate these cones. Okay, I'll just delete this sphere for now to make it not confusing. So if I go to the other viewports, you can see that some of the cones are inside this cube, so because of that we are not seeing that, right? So let's play again with the segments of cube and see what happens. So as I increase the segments of the cube, you can see these cones are generated in different directions. So I'll just hide this cube by double clicking this top line circle there. So notice how they are generated on the grid of the cube. So cube, I change this count, segment count, and they're all being arranged on the polygon centers. But maybe I can adjust to the vertex. So notice that how the corners started to become angled, right? When I chose vertex. I can choose edge, and it allows a different set of alignment of these edge properties, okay? So also a scale on edge changes how they are scaled. So you can see that how it affects this generated geometry. Okay? So of course, like I can use cones, or I can again use a combination of objects like a cylinder and a cone. Sorry. Let's make this radius thinner and change the placement. See, now they are again placed differently. Or only cylinder, I put this outside, and if I use only a cylinder, then I create a prism-like thing here, I don't know. So I can decrease the radius, and I create a mesh-like thing, cage-like thing here. Okay? So this cloning on top of objects, you'll need this, okay? So you can always, of course, like model, this doesn't have to be a regular cylinder, but you can also combine this cylinder with a deformer, or a bend deformer, let's say. Let's bend this cylinder by putting a deformer underneath, and let's fit the parent and bend that not in this direction but in this direction maybe. So I don't want it to be, I want it to be smoother, so what do I need to do? Yes, I go to the cylinder and increase height segments, because like the height is in this direction and there are 1, 2, 3, 4 segments only. So if I increase that, Notice how smoother it becomes. But don't overdo that because it will decrease the performance. Okay? So if I do that and put that cylinder inside the cloner, you see that now it's cloned while it's bent. Okay? So since I have control over this bend property, I can always play with how it responds to this. So maybe instead of a cube, cloning on top of a sphere might give a better result visually. So again, in the cloner, I drag the sphere into the object panel here. Okay. So, and clone this on top of, on to the vertices. Okay. And if I play with the bend property, you'll see how it responds. But notice that it doesn't bend towards neither up or downwards, but it's like a slightly angled bend. So how do you think I can manage that? How do you think I can play with that? I don't want it to be like a slightly to some side, to one side, but I want to be straight upwards. Any ideas? Okay, so I go to the bend deformer. Let's change alignment to Y, and don't forget to hit fit to parent after you do that. Okay, it distorted that, so I want to understand what's happening there. Okay, this is not that. So I go to the X and try that, fit to parent, and try that. No, it's not that either. Minus, no. Minus Y, no. Okay, this is not that. So it has to be a different property. So which is probably this angle thing here. So if I make that, it's again, let's say 45, and I'll hide the sphere to see if it's working or not. Okay, when I rotated it 45 degrees, it seemed to be working, right? This started to look like a chandelier in a way. So if I decrease or increase this, I'll just, okay. So of course you can always play with the radius of this, height values, bend, yeah, you can always play with that. Of course I can play with, add other deformers for the cylinder to adjust the form to my liking, but the angle solved my problem. So I can also make them point downwards. Like if it's 45 degrees, I need to add like 180 degrees, for example, so that it's faced downwards, right? So I can do math operations in those areas also. I hit plus 180 and hit enter, and you see that immediately that math operation is done here. So you can do multiplication, subtraction, division, all that math operations here. See, so you can always combine these things with each other. Okay, so let's delete that. And of course, like instead of a sphere, I can clone on things on top of a text object maybe. So let's write the traditional title here, and let's say, let's clone a cube. So I'll just scale it down before cloning it, okay? So, yeah, I'll just... By the way, you can use the keyboard shortcuts. If you hit E, it activates move tool. If you hit R, it's rotation, okay? And if you hit T on your keyboard, it's scale. So notice that E, R, T activates different tools here, okay? So if I hit T and start scaling, I can easily do this operation. So then I'll put this cube inside the cloner, and cloner, since it's in the object mode, doesn't do anything because the object is missing here. So I'll just drag this text to here, and it did something. But not the thing that I want it to do. So the text object, maybe, okay, not this, interpolation, no, not this. Okay, there is, this usually happens. Okay, I guess it's because of the connect object. Let's try that. Yeah. Okay, this is not so evident now, so I'll just leave this to a future part. So I'll not use this text object, but let's say a flower object. So you can also use splines to clone objects onto. So in the cloner, I drag this flower to the object part, and notice that how these clones are generated on the object. But since it's a spline, it has different properties. Like I can increase the count like this. Oops, sorry. Step. For example, I can adjust the spacing between those clones, or I can distribute them evenly. Okay. Vertices and that kind of stuff. So that allows me to, if I change the shape of the flower in a radius, notice how they are adjusting accordingly. See? So I go to here and change the distribution mode to vertex or step, let's say. So it dynamically responds to the shape of that object, right? So you can combine many things with each other, which is also valid for example, let's say you can put cloners inside cloners, okay? I'll just clone this rectangle in a radial form this time. Okay, I'll just put a rectangle inside a cloner, and okay, try it something like this. But this time I can add another cloner and put this cloner inside that, so that this cloner clones this cloner. Okay, so it's a little bit messy now. So the second cloner, I'll choose the linear mode, and instead of moving towards the y direction, I'll just move it into this direction, so it becomes clearer. So now this cloner is cloning rectangle in a radial mode like this, okay, and this cloner is taking this, which is this, and clones it in this direction, right? So if I increase that, it becomes something like that. Instead of that, I can maybe not linear, but choose the grid mode, and yeah, this. Okay, so it will become clearer now. So what you see now is, if I disable this, the second cloner, you see that the module is this, right? But if I activate that, this cloner uses this one as an object and clones that in this direction, right? So if I change something here, like for example, if I let's change that like this, the whole system adapts to that. See? So of course I can even put this cloner inside another cloner. It's like the movie Inception. So you can increase these things, but as you do things more, it will get more and more complex. So be careful and think whether if you really need it or not. So this is another method. Okay, so let's play with effectors then. I'm opening a new scene. I'll just add a cube, scale it down, add a cloner, put that inside a cube, inside a cloner. Maybe I can again scale it up. And let's like make this like this. Okay, what I want is like, this is too much ordered, right? Everything is very perfectly aligned on a grid. So, but I want it to be a lot more organic or random, let's say. So what can I do? So I can randomize the positions of each clone. So I want to affect the positions, scales, or rotations of each clone by using a tool called Effector, right? These are like, again, violet bluish colored, so they're also here, by the way. So when a cloner is selected, if you create an effector, let's say a random, notice immediately what happens. The positions are immediately randomized. There are some default values for that, and that is set immediately. So now there's an object called random, which is an effector, and this effector is affecting the positions of these cloners clones there. So let's see what parameters it has. By default, I won't be dealing with this, so I'll just dive into the parameter tab here. So by default, this position is active, okay? So when this is enabled, the positions of these cubes are randomized. To what extent? To the extent of these values here, 50 centimeters, 50 centimeters, and 50 centimeters at each direction, 3 dimensions. So if I zero them out, 0, 0, 0, notice that nothing is happening, okay? But if I click and drag some of them, see what happens. I start to set a range. For example, in Y direction, position Y direction, I'm making this, saying this random effector that, okay, randomize the positions of these cubes in Y direction within the range of like 400 centimeters, okay? They'll span 400 centimeters or 1,000 centimeters or whatever value that you're entering here. They'll be randomizing their positions there, okay? So that when I look from the top, they are seen as if they are not randomized, but if I look from the sides, you can see that they are randomly placed. It's similar to also you can use other directions. So let's zero this out and only use X direction. Okay. Or only use Z direction. So see, and if you combine these different directions, you can span them randomly in 3D space. So it seems like as if they are floating randomly in 3D space. So if I disable this random here, it returns back to its default state. So you're not destroying anything, but you're only modifying or affecting things. Okay?
Can I ask something?
Yeah.
Since random works without any child elements, like if we have more elements, then the cloner will the random affect all of them, or just
Okay. How this random is connected to the cloner? Maybe you're wondering. So I'm deleting this. Okay. I've just deleted the random effector. So look at this carefully. Notice that I said something before creating the effector. I selected this cloner and then created this random effector. So then it knows by default it's connected to that. But of course you have a way to edit that, which is visible if you go to the cloner, there's a tab called Effectors. Okay? So in the effectors, we see that the random effector is there. So in this box, this points to this random effector. So if I change the name, so you notice that it's the same name here, okay? But if nothing is selected, I'll delete this. If nothing is selected and you create this random effector, the random effector is created, but nothing happens here. Because this cloner now doesn't have that connection to this. But of course I can manually do that. I can drag this random effector and drag that here. And you see that the same thing happens. But I just showed you a shortcut. So select the cloner that you want the effector to effect, and then create the effector. That way, this cloner and the effector tab here automatically has this random effector there. Okay. So again, it's always, for example, random Y direction. For example, you can separate these effectors to different values. So, for example, I randomized this in the Y direction, and I also want to create. Okay, let's leave that to another part. So I'll just create this. It's affecting the positions, randomizing the positions of these cubes. But I also have the ability to scale them, right? So, for example, I can scale them randomly in the Y direction or in other directions also. I can stretch them like this randomly. Okay, notice that how I immediately started to have a cityscape-like look. Okay. So maybe it's too much in some directions, so I don't want them to be too thin. So if they're all 0, it means that nothing will be done. If it's 1, or you can also make this -1. So yeah, notice that how this absolute scale changes things, okay? And also you can use uniform scale so that they're all scaled uniformly but not stretched, Okay. So notice how randomly they are being scaled now. Of course, like you can combine this scale property with position so that they are randomly scaled and randomly positioned. Okay. So I disable this, and for example, since it's random, I want to change the randomness. I want to try another composition with this random scale property. Where should I go, do you think? Where can I find that? Any guesses? Any property names I should look for? I want to try another combination or another random scale value. Maybe I'm not asking it right, but okay. Does the seed value come familiar to anyone? Okay, I should look for the seed value, but where? In the random effector. So let's change it back to the random effector. So this effector tab here has the seed value. So if I change that, you can see it again, like it's randomized, right? So let's again, instead of even uniformly scaling it, let's do this. Like maybe I can try to create different. Oops. So let's create a plane object here and drag this so that it acts like a floor or something like that. Okay, so imagine that this is a city maybe. So I want to try a different combination of building placements, let's say. So you can see that it's immediately okay, so I can immediately play with the scaling and the placement areas. And also, this is not like Turkey, right? It's too much organized. I want the streets to be more random maybe, so I can play with the position, enable the position, but I don't want them to be scattered in the Y direction, so I'll just zero that out. And maybe play with this, like just a little, so that they are not so in a grid shape, but when I go to the cloner and object tab and change the spacing in a certain direction so that it becomes a more crowded cityscape maybe. Okay, so now I have these spaces to create some animation. So I don't know. See, so things become very easy when you start to create things procedurally. Okay, so one other property or tool will be so for example, now I've used this random effector to randomly place these objects, right? So I can also, inside the parameter tab, I can also play with the rotation. So there are three properties: position, rotation, and scale. So if I enable scale, it's like this with the parameters that I've selected. And also position randomizes the position slightly, and rotation obviously changes them randomly, right? So it becomes something like this, or this, or this. Okay, any questions until now? So add a random effector to your scene and try to make something similar. And in the last part, we'll be seeing maybe another effector, let's say a shader effector again. And then we'll see the fields and how to use those fields to selectively control those properties of these effectors. Okay, so at this time, a shorter break, 5 minutes. Okay, don't be late. So in 5 minutes we'll be here again, continuing seeing new things.